France, 1944. The war was supposed to be about good versus evil, allies versus enemies, us versus them. But in a destroyed village somewhere between the beaches of Normandy and the heart of Nazi Germany, a Navajo scout named Joseph Whitehorse would prove that humanity doesn't recognize borders, and compassion doesn't ask for permission. When he found a wounded German boy left to die in the rubble, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a child. And with 4 words that would echo through history, he changed everything. He's one of us now. This is the true story of how one act of mercy in the midst of hell reminded the world what it means to be human. The morning of October 12, 1944, broke cold and gray over the French countryside. Sergeant Jack Brennan's patrol moved through the skeletal remains of what had once been the village of Saint-Rémy-sur-Loire, a small farming community that now existed only as shattered stone and burnt timber. The smell of cordite still hung in the air, mixed with something worse, something organic and final. This was the aftermath. This was what victory looked like up close. Brennan raised his fist, and the patrol froze. 6 men, hand-picked for their ability to move quietly and think quickly. Among them was Joseph Whitehorse, a Navajo code talker, who had been reassigned to reconnaissance work after taking shrapnel in his left shoulder during the push through Cherbourg. Joseph moved differently than the other soldiers. Where they crashed through underbrush and kicked aside debris, he glided. His feet found solid ground instinctively. His eyes read the landscape like a language only he understood. Private Marcus Kim, the unit's medic, stayed close to Brennan. He was Korean-American, born in Los Angeles, and had spent the first year of the war proving he wasn't Japanese. Now he just tried to keep people alive. Corporal Rafael Gutierrez brought up the rear, his rifle sweeping left and right, his journal tucked into his breast pocket. Rafe wrote everything down. He said someday people would want to know what this was really like, not the sanitized version they'd get in newspapers. The village had been cleared 3 days earlier by the 30th Infantry Division, but intelligence reported a sniper still active in the area. 2 men from a supply convoy had been killed the previous afternoon, both shot from an elevated position. Brennan's orders were simple: find the sniper, neutralize the threat, move on. It was the kind of mission that could go smoothly, or turn into a nightmare in the span of a heartbeat. Joseph moved ahead, his M1 Garand held loosely, confidently. He paused beside the collapsed wall of what had been a church. The bell tower had toppled, and the bronze bell lay half buried in masonry, its surface scarred by bullet impacts. He knelt, touched the ground, then looked up at the surrounding buildings. Brennan watched him, waiting. Joseph had a sense for these things, an instinct that had saved their lives more than once. Sniper's gone, Joseph said quietly. Tracks lead east, maybe 8 hours old. He's not coming back. Brennan frowned. You sure? Joseph nodded. Boot prints, German issue, he was alone, probably ran out of ammunition or got orders to fall back. Either way, he's not here. Brennan considered this, then keyed his radio. Command, this is Brennan. Village appears clear. No contact. Requesting permission to do a final sweep and return to base. The radio crackled. Roger, Brennan. Sweep and return. Be advised. Enemy activity reported 2 kilometers north. Don't linger. Understood. Out. They spread out, moving through the ruins with practiced efficiency. Most of the buildings were too damaged to hide anything, but they checked anyway. You didn't survive this long by getting careless. Joseph moved toward the eastern edge of the village, where a row of stone houses had partially collapsed into their own cellars. Something caught his attention, a detail out of place. He stopped, tilted his head, listening. There, a sound, faint, irregular, breathing, but labored, wounded. He moved forward carefully, rifle ready, and peered into the shadows of a collapsed doorway. At first he saw nothing, then his eyes adjusted, and he made out the shape. A boy, maybe 14 years old, wearing the tattered remains of a Hitler Youth uniform. The boy was pinned beneath a fallen beam, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood had pooled beneath him, dark and thick. His face was pale, lips blue. He was dying. The boy's eyes opened, and for a moment, they locked with Joseph's. There was no defiance there, no hatred. Just fear, just pain. Just a child who wanted to live. Joseph lowered his rifle and called out, Brennan, Kim, over here. The others arrived quickly, weapons raised. When they saw the boy, Reactions varied. Brennan's jaw tightened. Kim immediately moved forward, medic instincts overriding everything else. Rafe pulled out his journal, then thought better of it and put it away. Jesus, Brennan muttered. He's just a kid. He's German, one of the other soldiers said. Private Collins, a farm boy from Nebraska who'd lost his brother at Omaha Beach. Leave him. We've got orders. Joseph was already kneeling beside the boy, assessing the injuries. The beam across his leg was heavy, but not impossible to move. The bleeding was serious but potentially manageable. The boy watched him with wide eyes, too weak to resist, too frightened to understand. Kim, get over here, Joseph said. Kim hesitated, glancing at Brennan. The sergeant said nothing, his face unreadable. Kim made his decision and knelt beside Joseph, opening his medical kit. We can't stay long, Brennan said. Command wants us back. Then we work fast, Joseph replied. He looked at the boy and spoke in slow, clear English. We're going to help you. Understand? Help. The boy didn't respond, but his breathing steadied slightly, as if some deep part of him recognized the tone, the intent. Joseph and Kim worked together to lift the beam. It took 3 men, Collins reluctantly joining in. The boy screamed when his leg came free, a raw sound that echoed through the ruins. Kim immediately applied a tourniquet, then began cleaning and bandaging the wound. It was bad, compound fracture, possible infection already setting in, but it wasn't hopeless. Why are we doing this? Collins asked, his voice tight. He's the enemy. He'd kill us if he could. Joseph looked up at him, his dark eyes steady. He's 14, he's not killing anyone. He's wearing their uniform. So was my grandfather when the U.S. Army forced him onto a reservation, Joseph said quietly. Uniforms don't tell you who someone is. They tell you who someone was told to be. Collins had no answer to that. He stepped back, shaking his head. Kim finished the bandaging and sat back. He needs a hospital. Real surgery. Without it, he'll lose the leg. Maybe his life. Brennan looked at Joseph. What are you thinking? Joseph reached into his pack and pulled out a canteen, held it to the boy's lips. The boy drank, coughing, then drank again. Joseph's face was calm, almost serene. He looked like he was somewhere else, somewhere beyond the war. In my culture, Joseph said, there's a teaching. If you save a life, that life becomes part of your people. You don't ask if they deserve it. You don't ask if it's convenient. You see someone dying, you help. That's what makes you human. He looked down at the boy, then back at Brennan. He's one of us now. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Rafe would later write in his journal that it was the most profound thing he'd ever heard, that in that moment, surrounded by destruction and death, Joseph Whitehorse had reminded them all why they were fighting in the first place. Not to kill, but to protect. Not to destroy, but to preserve. Not to divide, but to recognize the shared humanity that connected them all. Brennan was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. We take him back. Kim, rig a stretcher. Collins, help him. We move in 5 minutes. They fashioned a stretcher from salvaged wood and a tarp, carefully loaded the boy onto it. Joseph stayed beside him, speaking softly in Navajo. The boy didn't understand the words, but he seemed to understand the intent. His breathing eased. His eyes closed. The journey back to base was slow and tense. They moved through contested territory, every shadow a potential threat. Joseph walked beside the stretcher, one hand on the boy's shoulder, steadying him when the terrain got rough. Kim monitored vitals, administering morphine when the pain became too much. Brennan led from the front, his jaw set, committed now to seeing this through. They reached the forward operating base as the sun was setting. Lieutenant Harrison met them at the perimeter, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief when he saw the stretcher. Sergeant Brennan, what the hell is this? Wounded civilian, sir, Brennan said, the lie coming easily. Found him in the village, needs medical attention. Harrison looked at the Hitler Youth uniform, then at Brennan. That's not a civilian, Sergeant. He's 14, sir. He's a child. Harrison's face hardened. He's an enemy combatant. We have protocols. With respect, sir, he's a prisoner of war who requires medical treatment under the Geneva Convention, Brennan said. Private Kim has stabilized him, but he needs surgery. Harrison looked like he wanted to argue, but he was also a by-the-book officer, and Brennan had just invoked the rule book. Fine, get him to the medical tent. But I want a full report, Sergeant. This better not come back on me. Yes, sir. They carried the boy to the medical tent where an exhausted army surgeon took one look and started barking orders. Joseph stayed until the boy was taken into surgery, then stepped outside into the cool evening air. Rafe joined him, pulling out his journal. I'm writing this down, Rafe said. What you did today, what you said. People need to know. Joseph shook his head. I didn't do anything special. I just did what was right. That's exactly why people need to know, Rafe replied. He wrote in silence for a moment, then looked up. You really believe that? That he's one of us now? Joseph looked toward the medical tent, where doctors were fighting to save the life of a boy who, by all logic of war, should have been left to die. In my language there's a word, hojo. It means balance, harmony, walking in beauty. The war takes that away. It makes everything ugly, everything broken. But every time you choose compassion over cruelty, every time you choose life over death, you restore a little bit of that balance. You make the world a little more beautiful. He turned to Rafe. That boy didn't choose this war. None of us did. But we can choose how we fight it. We can choose to stay human. Rafe wrote that down, word for word. Years later, when he published his memoir, that passage would become one of the most quoted sections, studied in schools, referenced in speeches about the moral complexity of war. The boy, Dieter Schmidt, survived. The surgery was successful, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He was transferred to a POW camp, then repatriated to Germany after the war. In 1963, he returned to the United States, tracked down Joseph Whitehorse, and thanked him. They remained friends until Joseph's death in 1989. Dieter would later say that the moment Joseph knelt beside him in that ruined village was the moment he stopped believing in the ideology that had sent him to war. He saw, in the eyes of a man he'd been taught to see as inferior, a humanity that his own leaders had never shown him. He saw what it meant to truly be strong, not to dominate, but to protect, not to conquer, but to care. The story spread quietly through the ranks. Soldiers who heard it carried it with them, a reminder that even in the darkest moments there was still room for light. Some dismissed it as sentimentality, a dangerous distraction in a world that demanded hardness. But others understood what Joseph had understood, that the true battle wasn't just against the enemy in front of you, but against the part of yourself that the war wanted to turn into something unrecognizable. In the decades that followed, historians would debate the incident. Some saw it as a minor footnote, a feel-good story in a war full of horrors. Others recognized it as emblematic of a larger truth about the soldiers who fought in World War II, particularly those from marginalized communities. Native American soldiers like Joseph served with distinction, fighting for a country that had oppressed their people, yet maintaining their cultural values of honor, respect, and compassion. The Navajo code talkers are remembered primarily for their unbreakable code, the language that helped win the Pacific Theater. But their contribution went beyond cryptography. They brought with them a worldview that recognized the interconnectedness of all life, a philosophy that stood in stark contrast to the dehumanization that war demanded. Joseph Whitehorse embodied that philosophy. In saving Dieter Schmidt, he wasn't just saving one life. He was affirming a principle, that humanity is not negotiable, that compassion is not a weakness, and that the true measure of a warrior is not how many enemies he can kill, but how much of his own soul he can preserve. Sergeant Jack Brennan would later say that October 12, 1944, was the day he understood what they were really fighting for. Not territory, not ideology, but the simple, profound idea that every life has value, that every person deserves dignity, that the bonds of humanity are stronger than the divisions of war. Private Marcus Kim would carry the memory of that day through the rest of his service, through medical school, and into a long career as a trauma surgeon. He would tell his students that the most important lesson he ever learned came not from a textbook, but from watching a Navajo scout kneel beside an enemy child and choose mercy over vengeance. Corporal Rafael Gutierrez would fill dozens of journals before the war ended, but the entry from that day remained his most powerful. He wrote, "Today I saw something I didn't think was possible in war. I saw a man look at his enemy and choose to see a brother. I saw hatred lose and love win. I don't know if we'll win this war, but I know that as long as there are men like Joseph Whitehorse, we'll never lose ourselves." The war would continue for another 7 months. More villages would be destroyed, more lives lost, more horrors witnessed. But for the men of that patrol, something had changed. They had seen proof that the war didn't have to consume them, that they could pass through the fire and emerge still recognizably human. Joseph Whitehorse never sought recognition for what he did. He didn't see it as heroic, just necessary. When asked about it years later, he would simply say, "We're all related. That's what my grandfather taught me. The German boy, the American soldier, the French farmer, we're all part of the same family. The war tried to make us forget that. I just refused to forget." That refusal, that simple, stubborn insistence on maintaining his humanity in the face of inhumanity, is perhaps the greatest act of resistance any soldier can perform. It's easy to hate in war. It's easy to dehumanize, to reduce the enemy to a target, a threat, an abstraction. What's hard is to look at someone you've been told to kill and see a person. What's hard is to choose compassion when cruelty would be easier. What's hard is to stay human when everything around you is inhuman. Joseph Whitehorse did the hard thing, and in doing so he gave everyone who heard his story permission to do the same. He proved that you don't have to let the war turn you into something you're not. You don't have to sacrifice your values to survive. You don't have to become a monster to fight monsters. He's one of us now. 4 words, a lifetime of meaning, a reminder that in the end, there is no us and them. There's only us. Only humans trying to survive, trying to find meaning, trying to hold on to something good in a world determined to take it away. The village of Saint-Rémy-sur-Loire was rebuilt after the war. The church was reconstructed, the bell rehung. Today, a small plaque stands near the eastern edge of the village, where the old stone houses once stood. It reads, in French and English, "In memory of all who suffered here, and in honor of those who chose mercy over hatred." May we never forget that our common humanity is stronger than any force that seeks to divide us. Dieter Schmidt visited that plaque in 1985, accompanied by Joseph Whitehorse. They stood together in silence, 2 old men who had once been on opposite sides of an unimaginable conflict, now bound by something deeper than war, deeper than nationality, deeper than the ideologies that had tried to tear the world apart. A French journalist who witnessed the moment asked Joseph what he felt, standing there after all those years. Joseph looked at Dieter, then at the rebuilt village, then back at the journalist. "I feel grateful," he said. "Grateful that I listened to my grandfather's teachings. Grateful that I didn't let the war take away what made me who I am. Grateful that this man survived to live a good life, to raise a family, to prove that choosing life over death is always the right choice." Dieter spoke then, his English accented but clear. "Joseph gave me more than my life that day. He gave me back my humanity. I had been taught to hate, to see people as inferior or superior based on race, nationality, religion. But when he knelt beside me, when he looked at me with kindness instead of hatred, everything I had been taught collapsed. I realized I had been lied to. I realized that the only thing that truly matters is how we treat each other when everything else is stripped away." The journalist asked if they had stayed in touch after the war. Dieter smiled. "Joseph is my brother, not by blood but by something stronger. He saved my life, yes, but more than that, he showed me what it means to be truly strong. Strength is not domination. Strength is compassion. Strength is choosing to be human even when the world gives you every reason not to be." They visited Joseph's family in New Mexico after that trip, where Dieter met Joseph's children and grandchildren. They shared stories, shared meals, shared laughter. The children asked Dieter what the war had been like, and he told them the truth, that it was terrible, that it was senseless, that it was something that should never happen again. But he also told them about their grandfather, about the man who had shown mercy when mercy was the hardest thing in the world to show. "Your grandfather," Dieter told them, "is the reason I believe in goodness. When I see hatred in the world, when I see people divided by fear and ignorance, I remember that day in France. I remember that even in the darkest moment of human history, there was still light. Your grandfather was that light." Joseph's grandson, a young man named Thomas, asked his grandfather why he had done it. Why had he risked everything to save an enemy soldier? Joseph thought for a long moment before answering. "In Navajo tradition," he said, "we believe that all life is sacred, that we are all connected in the web of existence. When you harm another, you harm yourself. When you help another, you help yourself. The boy I found that day was not my enemy. He was a child, caught in something beyond his control, suffering and afraid. How could I walk away from that? How could I call myself a man, a warrior, a human being if I turned my back on someone who needed help? He paused, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The war wanted me to forget those teachings. It wanted me to see the world as us versus them, good versus evil, allies versus enemies. But my grandfather taught me that those divisions are illusions. There is only life, and our responsibility to protect it, wherever we find it. That's what I did. That's what any of us should do. Thomas would later become a teacher, and he would share his grandfather's story with his students every year. He would tell them that history is not just about dates and battles and treaties. It's about moments like the one in Saint-Rémy-sur-Loire, moments when individuals choose to be better than the circumstances that surround them, moments when compassion triumphs over cruelty, moments when humanity refuses to be extinguished. The story of Joseph Whitehorse and Dieter Schmidt has been told and retold over the decades, each telling adding new layers of meaning. It has been the subject of documentaries, academic papers, and countless discussions about the ethics of war and the power of mercy. But at its core, it remains a simple story. A man saw another human being in pain and chose to help. Nothing more complicated than that. Nothing more profound than that. In 1989, Joseph Whitehorse passed away at the age of 73. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including Dieter Schmidt, who traveled from Germany to pay his respects. Dieter stood before the assembled mourners and spoke about the man who had saved his life 45 years earlier. Joseph once told me, Dieter said, his voice breaking, that in his language there is a word, hoj-ho. It means walking in beauty, living in harmony with the world. Joseph walked in beauty every day of his life. He showed me that beauty is not something you find. It's something you create through your actions, through your choices, through your refusal to let hatred and fear control you. He looked at Joseph's family, tears streaming down his face. I owe him everything. My life, yes, but also my understanding of what it means to be a good man. He taught me that our humanity is not something we are born with and keep automatically. It is something we must choose every day, in every action. It is something we must fight for, especially when the world tells us to abandon it. Dieter lived until 2003, and in his final years he dedicated himself to speaking about his experience, particularly to young people in Germany. He wanted them to understand the dangers of hatred, the lies of supremacist ideology, and the power of compassion. He wanted them to know that the enemy is not the person on the other side of a border, or the person who looks different or believes differently. The enemy is the part of ourselves that refuses to see the humanity in others. I was that enemy once, he would tell students. I believed the lies. I wore the uniform. I was ready to kill and die for an ideology that saw some people as less than human. And then a man from a people my leaders called inferior showed me what true superiority looks like. Not the power to dominate, but the strength to show mercy. Not the ability to destroy, but the courage to preserve. Not hatred, but love. The students would ask him if he felt guilty for his part in the war, and he would answer honestly, every day. But Joseph taught me that guilt without action is just self-indulgence. The way to honor the mercy I was shown is to show mercy to others. The way to atone for the hatred I once carried is to spread love. The way to make meaning from suffering is to prevent others from suffering the same way. Today, the story of Joseph Whitehorse and Dieter Schmidt is taught in schools around the world as an example of the moral complexity of war and the enduring power of human compassion. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, there are moments of light. Even in the midst of systematic dehumanization, there are individuals who refuse to participate. Even when the world is divided into camps of us and them, there are those who insist on seeing only us. The lesson is not that war is acceptable if there are occasional acts of kindness. The lesson is that our humanity is always a choice, and that choice always matters. Joseph Whitehorse could have walked away. He could have followed orders, avoided complications, stayed safe. But he didn't. He chose the harder path, the path that required him to see an enemy as a human being, to risk criticism and consequences, to act according to his deepest values, even when everything around him suggested he should abandon them. That choice echoed through time. It changed Dieter's life, gave him a second chance to become someone better than the ideology that had shaped his youth. It affected everyone in that patrol, reminding them that they were still human, still capable of mercy, still connected to something larger than the war. It inspired Rafe to document the truth of what soldiers experienced, not just the violence but also the moments of grace. It influenced Marcus Kim's approach to medicine, his understanding that healing is not just physical, but moral. It shaped Jack Brennan's leadership, his recognition that following orders must sometimes be balanced against following conscience. And it continues to affect people today. Everyone who hears the story and recognizes in it a truth about what we owe each other as human beings. We owe each other recognition. We owe each other dignity. We owe each other the benefit of the doubt that beneath the uniforms and flags and ideologies, we are all just people trying to survive, trying to find meaning, trying to be worthy of the lives we've been given. He's one of us now. Joseph Whitehorse spoke those words in a moment of crisis, but they resonate far beyond that moment. They are a declaration of universal kinship, a refusal to accept the artificial boundaries that divide us, an insistence that our common humanity is more fundamental than any difference. They are a reminder that we are all one of us, all part of the same human family, all deserving of compassion and care. In a world that still struggles with division, that still sees too much hatred and too little understanding, that still allows ideology to override empathy, the story of Joseph and Dieter is more relevant than ever. It tells us that change is possible, that people can be redeemed, that mercy is not weakness but the highest form of strength. It tells us that we don't have to be prisoners of the hatreds we inherit, that we can choose a different path, that we can be better than the worst moments of our history. The war ended in 1945, but the battle for our humanity continues every day. It continues in every choice we make about how to treat others, how to respond to difference, how to balance justice and mercy. It continues in every moment when we must decide whether to see an enemy or a human being, whether to choose cruelty or compassion, whether to divide or unite. Joseph Whitehorse made his choice in a ruined French village in 1944. He chose to see a human being. He chose to offer help instead of harm. He chose to preserve life instead of taking it. And in making that choice, he didn't just save one boy. He saved a piece of all of us, the piece that believes in goodness, that hopes for redemption, that knows deep down that we are all connected, all one of us, all worthy of the mercy we would want for ourselves. That is his legacy. That is the lesson. That is the story we must never forget. Because as long as we remember it, as long as we honor it by living according to its principles, there is hope. Hope that we can overcome our divisions. Hope that we can choose compassion over cruelty. Hope that we can look at each other, across all the boundaries that separate us, and recognize the truth that Joseph Whitehorse understood. We are all one of us now. We always have been. We always will be. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of compassion and the importance of our shared humanity, subscribe to this channel for more true stories of courage, mercy, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and hit that like button to help spread this message of hope. Together, we can remember the lessons of the past and build a better future.